Hi everyone, this is Dr. Stringer again. This week, or this lecture, whichever it may be, we're talking about the theories of drug use. So this week we'll be diving in to kind of talk about what are the theories as to essentially why people use drugs, right? Do people do it because there's something wrong with them or something like that, or because other people are doing it? Various different ideas as to why people do it. Nobody really agrees, of course, because that would be too simple. But anyway, with that said, let's kind of dive into to talking about this, right? So one of the things to think about is you really need two necessary items for drug use to occur. You need a predisposition to use drugs, or at least a desire to do it, and availability. Uh, you, you could want to use drugs all you want to, but if they're not available, that's really going to limit your ability to do so. Um, and I've often thought, and others have too, that a lot of the issues with why meth is so prolific is because it doesn't have to be transported across any border or from one place to another. You just make it in the microwave, and you can sell it in your own town or whatever. So in these rural areas where it tends to be more prolific, you find that you don't need to ship it in from the big city. You just make it right in your own trailer or whatever. Um, so that's one of the things to think about as well with regard to that. You also think about demonology, right? We used to think that people committed crimes because demons had gotten inside their heads, or people are using drugs because the demons. Nowadays nobody would really believe that. I don't think, hopefully. But that was at one time, a popular theory. Um, so, looking at a theory, I'm not going to define what a theory is for you since it's already right there in front of you. But one thing to think about is nearly all theories are kind of partial in scope. Nothing really explains everything. Except for, I would say, social learning probably comes pretty darn close if there was anything that could do so. Um, but most and not all theories cover different aspects of the same thing, regarded as complementary rather than contradictory, although some theorists would say that some theories do contradict with one another, right? There are some theories that say that, that kind of assume that everyone would commit crimes or would use drugs if they weren't deterred from doing so, or if they didn't have the unavailability to do so, right? Um, Looking at like routine activities or deterrence or stuff like that. And others, would assume that, no, everybody doesn't want to use drugs. Um, everybody wants to do different things. So sometimes there can be some contradictoriness in there. So Andrew Weil is kind of the author of the Natural Mind. He's a Harvard-trained doctor who's been on drug use for a long time. And he talks about how there's this kind of biological drive to alter our state of mind, right? You know, it starts to show in early childhood where kids start spinning around in circles in order to kind of get themselves dizzy because they like it. And we often want to kind of alter our minds in some way, shape, or form. People will often, use alcohol to do so. I tell you, one of the drugs I am most bad about using is coffee. And coffee is a drug, right? Caffeine is a drug. And I use it to alter my mind in order to give me more energy and, make me better at talking to you all as I, use my drugs here. So, coffee is one of those things, right? Most all of us have probably used coffee. If you think about it, alcohol, coffee. Some people, when I was younger, it was very popular. Smoking was much more popular. Um, Nowadays smoking isn't that popular, but now it's vaping, right? Why do people use the vape pen? Well, the nicotine gives them a buzz and makes them feel good, right? So I think there's something to the idea that we do kind of like to alter our consciousness a little bit. even little kids. Um, Although they shouldn't be using any substances, right? Um, so Will likens drug use to other forms of consciousness alteration. Uh, yogi, Buddhist, sex, all these things, they make you feel good, right? I wouldn't know it to look at me these days because I'm not as athletic as I once was, but I really like to run. And when you run, it gives you that, what's known as the runner's high afterwards, right? It releases endorphins into your brain and makes you feel good. My wife says that she doesn't get that runner's high, so she doesn't do it. But anyway, so we really like to feel good, right? It's a natural thing. So why is some drug use considered wrong and some is not? Why am I allowed to drink coffee in my office while I'm talking with you all and recording a video, but I'm not allowed to take shots of tequila? Um, what's the difference? Drinking wine to complement a meal. I have a funny story about this. You'll find that I have stories about pretty much everything, and I'll try to keep them to a minimum. But I had a discussion with my aunt a few years ago, and it went on for longer than I thought it was going to. But essentially, she was drinking wine, and I don't remember how this started, and she was judging me for drinking a beer. And I was like, "What do you mean? You're drinking wine?" And she said, "No, I'm drinking wine. That's not drinking." And I had to sit there and ponder that, and I said, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Wine is not drinking. It's okay to drink wine." And I couldn't really wrap my mind around why she would say something like that. I was like, "You're saying that you're drinking wine is not drinking, but drinking is the active verb in that statement." And so I kind of let it go, but I knew what she was getting at. She was getting at the idea that we don't stigmatize drinking wine like we do beer. If I was taking a keg stand and drinking shots of tequila, that is much different. Or doing a beer bong, or shotgunning a beer, or even just drinking beer. Period, is considered different than drinking wine. Wine is the thing is wine is commonly associated with more affluent parts of society, right? You see it at cocktail parties and things like that. Whereas, beer bongs and keg stands and tequila shots are associated more with young people and parties and having fun and acting a little bit crazy. So, that's the thing. I think that's part of why we have some drugs that are legal and others aren't. Alcohol is legal because the people who are in charge of saying what's legal and what's not use alcohol. Uh, Perhaps the reason why marijuana is becoming legal is in some states is because some of the people in those states who are in charge and able to decide what's legal and what's not might not mind using marijuana so much. Anyway, but it doesn't really matter whether a drug is legal or not with regard to theories of why people use drugs. I think people would be more likely to use drugs that were legal than illegal. But anyway, so thinking about theories of drug use, there's three basic classes. There's the biological theories, there's the psychological theories, and then there's the sociological theories. So I'll go through a couple of these to kind of give you a brief overview here. Of course, you can always read more details in your textbook, and I would encourage you to do so. Um, so biological theories are, they're pretty much based on, your genes or your hormones and stuff like that, neurological factors, things like that. And there's two basic groups of those. One is the genetic theory that maybe there's something in your genes that causes you to use drugs or gives you a predisposition for addiction. And then there's also the idea that you might have some sort of metabolic imbalance, right? Um, and so if you look at, chromosomal differences in the population, like I said, there's this kind of idea that we have a predisposition to take or to use psychoactive substances. You can also have a predisposition to become addicted to them. Uh, I don't know if any of you are aware, but there are some people who are more likely to be addicted to things than others. Some people can go and drink, a few beers here and there, and that's not a big deal. I had a friend when I was in undergraduate school that he could not just drink a couple of beers and chill. If he drank one beer, he drank 50. And I'm over exaggerating with 50, but I mean there was just no kind of you know mediocrity there. It's like man, and then when someone gets to drinking a lot of beers, it get kind of annoying. I think sometimes. But anyway, but I think he had some sort of predisposition to do that, or maybe it was learned socially or something like that. So there's different theories as to why. It was been a psychological thing. Maybe he enjoyed the excitement or the attention that he got. Anyway, um, so then there's the metabolic imbalance, right? There's something specifically that makes you kind of predisposed to addiction. Uh, you know, there's something in your brain chemistry, so to speak, that's not working the way it should. Um, People who are, have mental problems sometimes will use crack rather than the drugs that are prescribed to them because the legal drugs have so many side effects that they won't use them. I forget what it is, the dissociative disorder that they have, but they'll also use crack, and somehow crack helps them. Uh, and the legal drugs do too, but they just have a lot of side effects, and so the people don't like to take them because of the side effects. But then you'll find them smoking crack, which helps them with their disorders. You have to think about this. If you have, many of you, probably some of you, at least, might have ADHD, right? So that's some sort of imbalance in your mind that's causing you to have trouble paying attention to your studies. It just so happens that you get prescriptions for the drugs. Now, you could have ADHD, and maybe you don't have a prescription, but you get some Ritalin or Adderall from your friend or whatever to use when you take tests or something like that, right? And so that ADHD is causing you to want to use these drugs. So that's a couple of different things that could contribute to it. I'm not the biggest of fans of the biological theories of things. I think at the very best they can kind of give you a predisposition to addiction or use of drugs or something like that. But I don't think that they're so much deterministic, right? And we want to make sure we don't think about it like that. Like, oh, your father was an alcoholic, so then therefore you're going to be an alcoholic. No, it's not determined that you're going to be an alcoholic. Now there is, a good amount of research that shows that there is, some sort of genetic relationship between uh, alcoholism within families. But that doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to become an alcoholic. There could be things that you could do. You could decide you don't want to drink because you know that alcoholism runs in your family. Right? So it's important to remember that these things are not deterministic. So anyway, so psychological theories focus on three main factors. One being positive or negative reinforcement, the second being inadequate personality, and the third being problem behavior proneness. Right. So reinforcement theories. You've probably heard of Pavlov and B.F. Skinner and kind of the idea of positive reinforcement through some of your maybe intro to psych or criminological theory courses and things like that. And this is the idea that as you get a reward, a positive sensation from doing something, you want to do it more. If you get a negative reinforcement or a punishment, uh, then you will probably do it less over time, right? And so you think about this, one thing that happens immediately when people use pretty much all drugs is that they get some sort of positive reinforcement, right? They get that good high feeling. And so then that reinforces the desire to want to use it. Now, as some of us know, the negative reinforcement often comes the next day after the keg party when you don't feel so good. And I often wonder if we knew that we were going to get a hangover every time we drank if we wouldn't do it. Because sometimes you don't get a hangover. There's many theories as to, oh, well, don't drink keg beer or don't mix the wine with the beer or don't, drink Goldschlager. Please don't. Uh, yeah, but anyway, drink more clear liquors, don't drink the brown liquors. All of these things are kind of theories as to how you can avoid the negative reinforcement because everyone's trying to, right? And then, of course, there's the other negative reinforcement that you can get from drugs is being caught with them, being arrested, losing your job, things like that. The big negative reinforcement nowadays is overdosing and dying from it, which is a real problem, right? Anyway, uh, lack of self-esteem is another thing. Sometimes people want to just kind of escape, right? Escape from their reality. Maybe they have some personality problems, such as low self-esteem, and they just want to get away from it. And so I think that's a plausible, psychological theory, right? That the drug use might mask some of life's problems, and so that's, one thing to think about. Um, Clicker was working. Okay. Um, and the more inadequate the personality, the greater likelihood that you're going to, become involved in drugs. And it can become kind of a crutch, right? That you depend on. Some people depend on coffee to be able to function. Then you're becoming drug dependent, right? Uh, I don't know. I haven't stopped drinking coffee for a while. I wonder if I went for a little bit without drinking coffee, how I would do. It'd be interesting. Another thing would be interesting for you all to try too. All of us to try is to try to cut out sugar completely, because pretty much everything that we get nowadays has a bunch of sugar in it. So try to do that. I bet we'd have withdrawals from that too, right? So we use these things as kind of a crutch. Um, self-esteem, self-degradation theory is one type of an personality issue. Drug use and things like that can be responses to kind of self-rejecting attitudes or low self-esteem and stuff like that. For some, you might even have normally approved activities and group memberships that are kind of sources of painful experience. Maybe you have some family that it's like, oh man, I gotta go talk to these people, right? Or maybe you have some other issues that are going on, and drugs can be used as a way to kind of deal with that, as a kind of coping mechanism, so to speak, right? Anyway, problem behavior proneness, risk taking. Uh, I always talk about this as risk taking behavior because you have some people that drive 100 miles an hour all the time, right? If you're prone to driving 100 miles an hour, if you're a thrill seeker, a person that likes to take risks, you're more likely to use drugs too, right? If you're willing to drive 100 miles an hour, then there's a good chance that you won't mind driving while you're intoxicated either, right? And so people that have kind of these risk-taking propensities, I often call it, are more likely to use drugs. Are also more likely to do a lot of other things that involve risks. Go snow skiing and stuff. I did that a couple of times. It was not for me. Anyway, but the more unconventional you are, obviously, the more likely that you are to do these things and become a more serious drug user as well because you like the thrill. Um, and then finally, we move into the much broader kind of sociological theories of drug use. I have often said that because drugs are sociologically defined, we literally define what a drug is, right? And which drugs are legal and which ones are not. So then, since we define these things socially, we really have to look to social theories as to why people are doing them, right? So there's a few that I have listed here that I believe are in your textbook as well. An enemy, or often known as strain theory, is a big one. Um, and you can look at that, and that's essentially these people that are kind of retreating from adapting to how society is working. Maybe they have tried and tried and tried to accept society's goals and to kind of be able to achieve them. And we all tend to have similar goals, right? We want to be successful. We want to have a lot of money. We want to have a nice house. All of these things. but they've been unsuccessful at doing that, and the means of achieving it. Right? We're supposed to go to school and do good in school and get a good job, and that's supposed to give us the wealth and happiness that we've always wanted. Interestingly, it seems like everything in our society revolves around having money, right? But anyway, uh, so you end up with two different types of people. There's the innovators. They want to get rich, and they want to do it, but they reject the means of doing so, the legitimate means. And there's a lot of theories that tell you, well, if people have this goal of getting rich and they can't do so legitimately, then guess what? They'll do so illegitimately. And drug dealing is one such innovation, right? Um, then you also have people, and this is often related to depression and things like that too, where they just kind of retreat from accepting the goals of society, and they say, "Well, I give up," pretty much, right? They reject the means of this, and then they kind of retreat into drugs and alcoholism in order to kind of they retreat into that reality, and that kind of becomes their day-to-day life. And oftentimes, that can be a big problem. Anyway, um, so social control and self-control theory. Um, this is Travis Hershey's work. The idea that those that are the most attached, committed, involved, and have positive beliefs about society will be less likely to use drugs. It's also generally used as a crime theory drugs use is a crime, right? Will not use drugs. And then there's also self-control theory, right? Which pretty much just says that if you have low self-control, that you will then use drugs. And the big problem with that a lot of people have is it's kind of tautological because of this kind of risk-taking propensity that I had or that I mentioned earlier. It becomes very hard to measure this. And it's really that these people have a risk-taking propensity or low self-control, but how do you measure the difference between having low self-control as measured as taking a lot of risks and drug use? Because isn't drug use taking a risk, especially with some drugs? I mean, you never know, you could die. And so how do you tell whether there's a relationship between the two when they're both essentially the same thing? Uh, anyway, and then one of my favorite theories is social learning theory, right? And social learning theory posits that we learn how to do things socially. Nobody's born knowing how to roll a joint. Nobody's born knowing how to take a keg stand. It's something that we learn from other people, right? Nobody's born knowing how to cook crack or make meth. It's something that's learned. No one's born knowing how to use drugs, period. And so they have to learn this. Somebody, somewhere along the way, must have decided that there was a plant over here that they were going to roll up and put in a paper and smoke. And then people learn that from that person. We're not born knowing how to walk and talk. We just see other people doing it and we think it looks good. So that kind of gets at the idea that all of the drug use and things, it's kind of hard to explain biologically because biology doesn't tell us how to use drugs. Society does. We learn it from other people. If we lived, let's say we lived on a deserted island our entire life, and we never had any interaction with any other person, we would be very different people, right? I don't even know if we'd know how to talk. We would just kind of grunt or be cavemen. But I would be willing to bet that we probably wouldn't use drugs. We might figure out some way to spin our around, and we might find some stuff growing somewhere and might figure out how to use it. I don't know, but the likelihood of that happening is way, way lower. Anyway, and then there's kind of subculture theories. And Howie Becker was one that came up with one of becoming a marijuana user, and kind of how if you hang out with people that use marijuana and you're part of that subculture, then you're more likely to use it yourself, right? Or any other type of drug. One of the biggest problems that we find is when people go into drug rehab, they will come out and they'll do perfectly fine. But as soon as they go and hang out with their old friends again that are still using drugs, they relapse like that. It's ridiculous how fast that happens. And so it becomes very difficult, though, especially when it's part of a family. So maybe the husband had gone into drug rehab or something, and then he gets out, but he goes back to live with his wife and his children, or the rest of his family, or whoever he's living with, and the other people in the house are still using. It's almost inevitable that that person will start using drugs again. And so one of the best things to do there is to get people out of that environment, to get them to move. Uh, you know, we have what are called Oxford houses, which, if you think of it, are very similar to like a halfway house in the criminal justice system. But the Oxford house is where a bunch of people essentially live, and it's kind of like a dorm, and everyone there is clean and not allowed to use. And that's kind of they go to meetings and they all kind of help support each other. And if anyone ever pops positive for a drug test or is arrested or something like that for using, then they're immediately kicked out because you can't have one person using it in the house because it will literally contaminate everyone else, and the other people will start doing it. There was a guy I went to high school with that he had been in and out of drug rehab a few times, and I don't know if I've told you all, but I'm from Virginia Beach, and so he had gone and he lived in the Outer Banks of North Carolina for a while in the Oxford house. He'd been out of rehab for like a year or so. He was doing great, and he came back up to Virginia, and I think he was in Norfolk, hanging out with some of his old friends, and he ended up using again. And I think he got arrested, so he got kicked out of the Oxford house, and all of this stuff. All he was doing great until he went back to hang out with those people that were still using drugs. So anyway, it's a little side story. This kind of gets at the idea, like birds of a feather, will flock together, right? Um, you are who you hang out with. It's interesting, like selective interaction, though. So, is it that you hang out with a bunch of people that drink because you drink, or do you drink because you hang out with a bunch of people that drink? It's kind of the chicken or the egg, argument, right? Which one came first? So there is some kind of selectivity bias in there. Conflict theory. This is an interesting one, especially when it comes to drug use. And we'll talk some more about this as we move on through the class, and as we talk especially about how some drugs are legal and some are illegal, and some drugs like crack you have a much higher penalty for than cocaine. And crack is commonly associated with African American urban, cultures, and cocaine is used more amongst upper middle class white people. So one drug you get a much stronger sentence, even though they're really kind of the same thing. Like I said, the only difference is one has baking soda and heat and water, and the other doesn't. So it gets at a kind of a conflict of these things. And it's not fair, to be frank, that it is that way. And this kind of gets at the conflict theory's idea that kind of race and class and social structure help to define which drugs are illegal, which ones are illegal, and then the punishments for different types of drug use or possession of different types of drugs. And those that have more, so to speak, power within the conflict structure will have their drugs be legal, while those that are lower on the totem pole will not. And so I think that's an interesting theory, especially when it comes to drug use, because you see that social conflict quite prolific within a lot of the policies over time and things like that. And we'll talk about the war on drugs and historical perspectives and things like that later on. But just to give you a little tidbit for now. Anyway, so Alfred Lindesmith proposed a sociological theory of addiction. That opiate addicts do not continue for euphoric effects, but of the drug, but rather to avoid the withdrawal. This is what I'm talking about with drug dependence. That sometimes people aren't doing it anymore to get high; they're doing it to avoid withdrawal. They're doing it to avoid being sick, and this is very common with drug addiction. He came up with this in 1938. That's pretty impressive. Like I said, One of the problems, uh, it's been a problem for quite some time, is the idea that the soldiers would go off to war and get injured, and then they'd be given opium or morphine or heroin, depending upon what time of the, or what decade or what century it was, uh, for their pain, and then they become addicted to these things. So uh, anyway, he found that those that were given opiates were more likely to become addicted if they knew what they were given than experienced withdrawal symptoms. So that's interesting. If people knew that they're being given opiates, they're more likely to become addicted to them. So if they don't know what it is, probably, well, I think, if I remember correctly, it's because if you know what you were given, then you can seek it out once you get out of whatever medical facility you're in. But if you don't know that you're seeking out an opiate, then, well, I don't know what the heck I have. Yeah. So that's something to think about as well. Anyway, so with that, I will end our little talk about theories of drug use, and I will talk to you all next week. Of course, uh, please don't forget to do your homework assignments and study. Don't forget to read the chapter too, because it's very interesting and it's not too long either. So it's a pretty good read. Anyway, I hope that you'll enjoy some of this content, and we'll be moving forward next time to talk about drugs and crime. So until then, everybody, have a good day.